Welcome to Between Product and Partnerships, a podcast focused on bringing together product, partnership, and engineering leaders to discuss how to build, support, and scale SaaS ecosystems. Presented by the SaaS Ecosystem Alliance and sponsored by Pandium, an integration platform and marketplace for ecosystems.
Welcome. I'm Kelly Sarabin, the Director of Marketing at Pandium and the co-founder of the SaaS Ecosystem Alliance. Today, we're going to be chatting about developer experience and developer relations. Welcome, Sid. Can you give us a sort of background on your history in the field?
Sure. I'm Sid Maestre, and I'm currently the Director of Developer Experience and Advocacy at Lob. And I've been in the developer relations field for about a decade. Previously, I was at Xero, where I did a lot of work with partners and with building our ecosystem, and got my initial start with PayPal. So definitely have been around different companies, different sizes.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. I think, developer relations has been around for a while because you've had SaaS products that are for developers for a while. And so those companies kind of out of the gate have to think about the developer experience because that's their customer, right? But now, in the last, especially 5 years, even pretty early stage SaaS companies have to start rolling out that API so they can be interoperable, even if their customer is a business user, say like a real estate CRM. It's being used by real estate agents, but then you get to a certain point and there's a need to have that be interoperable with the other systems they're using. And so, sort of as a discipline, with when you have those partner developer experience instead of just the customer experience, then is there things that really are different and that organizations need to think about differently, or can they just take all the learnings from that field of developer relationships that was aimed at customers and really just apply it to the partner experience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I think about it, to me, a partner is just a special kind of developer. So often when you are building, let's say, APIs for developers, you're thinking about, authentication, and you're thinking about how do I develop an onboarding experience for that developer, documentation, all of those things. You definitely need all of those things for partners. But my experience is that when you develop an actual partnership program, the people that you end up talking to don't necessarily end up being the developer. It could be a business development person, a marketing professional who's looking for a channel with which to sell their product into, or it could even be a founder if it's a small company, and they're really interested in, like, what is your partner program about? What are the benefits? What do I have to do to become a partner? Whether it's engineering resources, and it's an investment. So they definitely do their due diligence before they start building. They might have some engineers poke around, play around with your APIs or look at your stack, but they want to understand, like, what's the ROI if I'm going to partner with you. And that often means they want to talk to a person. So I've definitely been on the receiving end of those phone calls, and it's a lot of fun. You get to understand these businesses, these startups, and the cool stuff they're building. So I've really enjoyed that aspect of it, but it is very different from developer evangelism or advocacy, where you're out there, speaking at events and building code samples and things like that. It's a slightly different audience, kind of a superset.
Yeah, so and I think as companies scale like to the size of, say, Salesforce, right? Like you have a lot of I think you always still have that business partnership person who's coming in first. I think I think I generally agree with you. They want to make sure there's enough of a business justification. But then the developer comes in to try to like give a sense of how hard is this going to be to build, right? Like, is this going to be a nightmare? Um, do you do you see SaaS companies shifting moving forward to try to make that more developer first and really just because these large companies like Salesforce, right? They have this whole developer community, but it's a mix of customers and partners. And in fact, it's probably more customers than partners. But do you see companies making the move to try to attract the developer partner specifically by saying, "Hey, we've got these great API docs. We're so easy to work with," um, or do you not see that in the market yet?
Um, yeah, I don't know if I've necessarily seen that. I mean, I'm a strong advocate for creating great developer experiences, and I think that that should always be a priority. But if I'm being honest, what I've observed at Zero, because I was there for 7 years, I saw a huge improvement in developer experience. And if I think back to the first couple years I was there, I was often amazed at what partners what partners are willing to put up with, as far as like just things were missing. We didn't have everything in place for them, but they were so excited to uh, join Zero's ecosystem and to connect with our our customer base, and just they saw a real opportunity there, and they were willing to like kind of work through things with us, and so I would say smaller SaaS companies, that if they've got a great opportunity, they may not have all the bells and whistles or the infrastructure that a Salesforce might have, but they can still succeed if they've got a strong value proposition, I think.
Yeah, so if a SaaS company is moving to that stage where they're like, we're going to have at least one person focus on the developer experience and making sure that they can get in here and use our APIs, build a product integration, and not hate us at the end of the process. Like, what what are the like sort of big bucket priorities that you would say to an organization to really focus on first and make sure that's taken care of?
Yeah. Um, well, I'll talk about both the developer and then the partner and kind of share my thoughts on that. I think across the board, if you ask any developer, they're going to say documentation is their number one priority. And when we say good documentation, it it can be how it's presented. Is it written for humans? Is the layout design easy to navigate? Can I get all the information I need? And most importantly, is it up to date and accurate? Like, nothing frustrates a developer more than when they land on some out of date documentation and they spin their wheels for a couple hours only to discover that actually things have changed and the company hasn't gotten around to updating their doc. So documentation, number one. The actual experience of getting your API keys, onboarding, that piece, that's super. If you're putting up barriers and roadblocks, asking for credit cards or saying that you have to go through, like, you have to even get approved just to play with the APIs and experience it, I think that is a real poor pattern. And so you tend to see that in larger companies, like maybe a bank or somebody who has information that they feel very protective of. That can be a problem. I don't think SaaS companies have that issue. And then on the partner side, uh, making sure that that you've thought through that partner journey. Like, if you just stick up a form and say, or stick up an email and say, email us and partner with us, but then that partner inquiry goes into a black hole, you don't get back to them in a timely manner, like, you can sabotage a partnership from the get-go if you haven't really thought through how am I going to not just get people in the door, but how am I going to curate a really great experience for them from the partnership side as well as the developer side. So that to me is sort of the beginnings. There's a whole lot more you can and should do, but like, Rome wasn't built in a day, so we all have to start somewhere, and those are some good places to start, I think.
Yeah, and do you have any advice on sort of either tooling or processes that companies can consider to make sure those docs stay up to date? Because I think obviously as you say, it's one thing to get them launched and they look beautiful and it's great and everybody's happy, but then things happen, right? The API gets updated, some things might be go out of service essentially, and how do you sort of, is there tooling that can help with that, and then B, if not, is there some kind of a process that you would recommend that sort of ensures that that doesn't fall into a black hole?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I'm a huge fan of a lot of folks out there in the API community who are always beating the drum around best practices. So API governance is something we talk a lot about. We don't, as companies, we don't always prioritize this, but having policies in place and how you build new APIs, how you deprecate old APIs, how you communicate these things to your developers, that's to me, that's the process side of things that I think is important. And then you're touching on an area that I'm been pretty passionate about for several years, which is I love API specifications. I know that sounds really nerdy, but um, I'm a true convert. When we were at Zero, that was something that I really championed internally and helped build. Basically, reversed engineered specifications and then use those to start building SDKs that were supportive of like multiple languages. And whenever there was a change in the API or we discovered a bug in our specification, we could update it there and then it would roll out into multiple languages. And then interestingly, the team that was managing our documentation saw that project and rolled that into their process. So it's now become a single source of truth around, well, what is the description of our API? And when we change our API, we also want to make sure we update our specification so that all the tools, the documentation, anything else. I think at Zero, they're also built their entire API interactive explorer from the specification as well. So they're really leveraging it in some major ways, and I think it's delivering a much better experience.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about the SDKs coming from the specification, because I'm doing this large research project and studying 600 SaaS companies at different stages of development, and I was interested to find that in terms of external public APIs, the 100 largest SaaS companies, the top 50 public and the top 50 private, the vast majority had a bunch of SDKs for their APIs. But then when I went down to the Series D, right there, which are pretty sizable companies, the majority of them no longer did. They did. The majority of them had public APIs, but no SDKs. So I found that to be interesting because it made me wonder, is it that much work to, because clearly there's a recognition that it's a benefit to the developer to have that as an option. Is it a ton of work to maintain those SDKs over time? Or is the specification a way to make it manageable? Is there a tool there that facilitates that process between the specification and the SDK building?
Yeah. Yeah, no, by the way, I'm super interested in seeing the outcome of your research. Yeah, the report. So like add me to the list for that. I want to check it out. But yeah, this is a really interesting question. So if I go back to, let's see, it was 2014, I was at Zero and we didn't have any, like we had a couple SDKs that were in various states of quality that were owned by the engineers in their free time. And there were some community ones that were written, but nobody really owned them. And I remember like talking to the folks who ran the platform team. I said, shouldn't we be offering some official SDKs for like the 6 major languages out there? And the answer I got back was super interesting. They said, our API support ends at the endpoint. In other words, in other words, and they weren't saying it in a way like that they were trying to shirk responsibility or they didn't care. It was really like, we're such a lean team. Like we have to focus all of our engineers on building functionality for these APIs. We don't have the bandwidth to build all these SDKs and own all of these. But a few years later, Xero's really growing. They start exposing APIs for banks, and I ended up in an email thread where a bank was asking us for our Java library, and we just had a couple like random snippets of code that we were sharing with developers. And honestly, I was kind of embarrassed. I thought, gosh, like we have to do better. Like if banks are adding us to their infrastructure, our APIs, like we should really like level up our game. And so that led me into this journey of handcrafting the very first iteration, but then discovering Swagger and open API specs. I thought, this could be a way to really automate those improvements, get more robust coverage initially in the Java SDK, but then that spread to other languages after that. And so it was an investment. Like there's a big time investment, and so I think there is an argument like when is the right time to do it. And you can also argue that with so many great open source libraries out there and talented developers, like they could just pull down an OAuth 2 library as long as you're following the standard, like they could figure it out. And so a lot of startups are very comfortable managing their ecosystem in that way. But, as your pool of developers grows and you get more and more technical questions, you also might realize that you can't give any standard support because there is no standard library that your developers are using. They're using, one of a dozen Java HTTP clients out there, and you now need to be an expert in all of those, or, hope your community will chip in and support each other, because it's hard to have all that technical mastery inside your company. So my perspective was, if you limit it to, these are the 6 official ones, these are the ones we can and will support, you sort of shrink that support footprint. And so, as your developer community grows, there might be that tipping point where you want to do that.
Yeah, and I think I love your thoughts on developer community in general, because I think for people who have SaaS products that are used by a business user primarily, and then they're trying to build this interoperability for product integrations and for partners, it's a lot harder to build out that community. For example, like I'm a Webflow user, which is primarily a no-code tool, but they have released some, APIs that is not super robust at this point, but there are APIs available. They released webhooks now. And so there's some stuff you can do, but if you ask a question in their forums, which are quite busy for the normal use cases, there's not a lot out there. There's some out there. I've been able to find code snippets that I can put in as custom code, but like a lot of times it's not there. And I think if you don't have a developer product where you have all your customers also being able to answer those questions, it can be hard. So I guess, my question to you is, when should organizations think about investing and trying to build this? Like, how many potential partner developers? Is there a number of like potential partners that you even need to make this a realistic thing? Because I will say this too, like I've been on a lot of forums for these partners, developer partners, and they're just dead. Like the last comment was like 6 weeks ago. But I think the company was trying to provide a place for developers to help each other and connect. And I think it's fine that the forums are there. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on like, when is that a realistic thing to try to invest in for the partner developers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think what you're describing is that you're missing that critical mass, right? And the question becomes, does the company have the resources to really be there to seed these conversations and to be there? Like, it's hard to get that momentum going unless you invest in it. Like, communities don't just, appear out of nowhere. Like it feels like in your example with Webflow, you're a little bit of an early adopter of these more developer centric features, and the community historically has been tending to be more designers, I imagine. And people, we use Webflow over at Lob, so we've got someone on staff who's like super talented and really into that community. Maybe I should introduce you to her. She's super smart. She's always giving us tips. She's always figuring out how to make magic happen with that tool. But I sort of feel like that is a part of developer relations, and part of the developer advocate role is to be there to be that initial touch point, be the backbone for the community until the community has matured to the point that you can take a step back and sort of observe the growth and the organic magic that can happen. This happens on GitHub, I think, all the time, where companies put out, SDKs, or they'll open source projects that they use internally. And if nobody really invests and wants to own that, it can turn into a little bit of a ghost town around a project. And a bad look is when you've got a bunch of unanswered issues, open pull requests that nobody's responding to for 6 months or more. It makes the company not look bad, and it makes them look bad. And so I would say, if you're going to invest and build a community, make sure you have those resources, have that ownership, and be there to like support the people, because otherwise you're setting yourself up to look like you don't really care about that segment of your audience.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as part of this project too, I was surprised. I think we all know how common REST APIs have become, but I was surprised that it was even more common than I would have predicted, especially so the larger companies tend to have REST, but also like potentially 3 or 4 other styles. A lot of SOAP still exists, and people in certain industries have different things. But if you take your like typical SaaS company that was started in the last 5 years, and a lot of them are using that REST API. And I think, part of it is because you now have more developers who know how to work with that standard. So especially when you have partners who might just be building one integration instead of using your product every day, that's advantage to have a standard that more people are familiar with. So I was just wondering, have you seen any other sort of emerging standards, styles, protocols that you think are sort of bubbling up, maybe the next thing, or something we might not be aware of that people are already sort of adopting in that space of, what makes these products interoperable?
Yeah. I think that you're touching on something that is really true, which is that REST has become, RESTful APIs have become just the standard, and it's always good to look for like that next thing. But I feel like REST is that backbone of so many SaaS applications. And what I hope is happening today that didn't happen 5 or 10 years ago necessarily is when teams are building their products and they're building that front end that's talking to a back end through APIs, typically, that they're thinking about like, how do we leverage this same interface for developers and third parties? Because what typically will happen is they can build like a really tightly coupled application, and they'll not really think about ever publicly exposing it. And then suddenly in a strategy meeting, someone will say, hey, we need to like open up our platform. We need to become a platform now. We're not just a product, and we need to open up all these APIs. And developers are like, oh, we didn't build our APIs with that in mind. And now we are forced to either refactor in a major way while customers continue to use these APIs, or we do the opposite, which is we rebuild them, but for public consumption. And then you get this like real challenge of continuing to open up new features inside your product, but also selecting what to open up to your developer community. So for me, REST is always going to be there, but if you can build API first and you can think ahead to that possibility, you're setting yourself up for success. As far as new technology, I know GraphQL, like there was so much buzz about that. And I think it's come back down to reality where GraphQL is really great for specific uses. If you're trying to pull multiple pieces of data from different places and you don't want the developer to have to make a series of a dozen API calls to collect their data, you can construct those queries, and GraphQL is a great solution. But I wouldn't say get rid of REST, replace it with GraphQL. No one would, in their right mind, would probably say that. But I think it has its place. What I think is much more interesting is webhooks and more event-driven architectures and all the different protocols that you might want to explore and make available for your developer community, because nobody wants to pull a RESTful API every couple minutes to see if there's any new data. It's much more efficient on everyone's behalf to get those events sent to you. And I think a lot of companies tack on webhooks at the end after they've been around for a while. But if there's a real strong use case and you could start offering those sooner, I think that developers really benefit from having that notification and being able to subscribe to the information that they're most interested in instead of having to pull a RESTful API.
Yeah, and I think that I'm definitely seeing a lot more companies offer webhooks, and even if they just start offering it only for 4 or 5 outbound events, it's at least something, and presumably they're choosing those use cases that they're most getting feedback on needing, which I'd love to hear what your take is on collecting developer feedback and sort of, once you have this out, you have this available, you have partner developers, they're using the APIs, they're building integrations. What's the best way to sort of make sure you're really collecting their feedback in a systemic way, not just getting the noisiest people who are who are the loudest, for example, but really getting an understanding of because as you said originally, when it comes to the partner relationship, right, you have these business stakeholders who may have certain needs and be saying one thing, and then you have the developers who may even be very kind of behind the scenes and not in close contact with you. But they might be having a different experience. They might be like, your rate limits are horrible and you're kind of sabotaged this use case because I'm getting in timeout and I can't, my customer's not happy. So yeah, do you have an approach in terms of being sort of systematic about getting that feedback and making sure it's incorporated internally into your organization?
Yeah. You're touching on, I think, a real sore topic for a lot of developers when you start talking about rate limits. Yeah. In fact, I was going to say, like, something that if you do start building libraries and SDKs, like having some way to help with managing rate limits, reading those header responses, building in retry, building in timeouts to wait to then retry after a minute's passed and the rate limit's now back to 0 and you can start again. That can all be addressed technology wise. But when you talk about feedback, I think there's so many different ways that you can approach that. When I think about the online communication and the ways that I've received feedback from developers, it's true. It's sometimes the loudest, most angry developers that you notice. And interestingly, if you get into a conversation with them, usually, like, if you can get on a phone call with them or a Zoom call with them, like within a minute or two, it becomes like the nicest, most productive conversation because they are so happy that you're listening to them. Once they kind of get the steam out, they then really start giving you amazing insights into how they're experiencing your product, what the real challenges are, and real specifically, like what they would love to see changed, fixed, improved. And so I've done that before where like someone was really angry on Twitter and reached out, DM'd with them and said, hey, can we jump on a quick 15-minute call and just talk through this? I'd love to hear like what's going on with you. So that's the sort of one-on-one engagement. I think forums, if you've got some kind of developer forum where the people can post questions, through those questions you actually can start to discover common problems or common threads through the community, because people will jump onto that thread and they'll share their frustration or their stories. And you can even use tools out there to like actually solicit feedback and let people vote up different things that are important to them that they love to see fixed. That's all online. What I found is also in person. I love, well, we're now hopefully getting back to reality, like a little bit normalization, and we can go see each other again in person. I'm looking forward to that. But in the past, we've done road shows for developers where we travel to different cities. Xero used to do these big XeroCon events where our partners would come and they'd exhibit, and I would spend the entire event walking around talking to different partners and building the personal connection, but also hearing like what they love about the program or the APIs, or what their real pain points are. And then also we even brought in a select group of partners into like a 20-person roundtable. And what was most interesting was the way that they fed off of each other and sort of built off each other's ideas. So instead of just having a one-to-one conversation, if you get a group of people together who are all have this shared goal of being successful in your ecosystem, they can start to build on each other's ideas, start coming up with solutions, come up with great suggestions for you. And I found that extremely rewarding. So there's so many ways you can slice this. It just depends on the size of your community and the resources you have available to go and engage with them. But whatever you do, try to engage with them and be open, listen, ask, be curious, ask questions. I think it's a great way for you to improve your product and your APIs.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Is there some ways that you can use sort of the more quantitative usage, API usage, to sort of gauge where there might be problems? I'm just thinking, if you're looking at, say, this many developers, they got a client ID in secret and then they never made a call, or these people did make a call, but then they just abandoned. Is there things that you can look for to like say, hey, there's a problem in this part of this process? Or I mean, maybe you're just, I don't, maybe you're just seeing people are constantly being boxed out because they violated the rate limit. Maybe that's a sign that you need to look at that or create a bulk endpoint, because there's something there. Are there things like that that you can sort of look to kind of supplement the qualitative conversations?
Yeah, I absolutely think that having folks who are building the APIs also get access to the raw API logs and figure out ways to analyze and look at different patterns. I know at Xero we would often look at like 400s, 500s, and we would look at those, and often those would often surface on an individual level. I mean, you could definitely do it on across your entire developer base. I would say that we definitely had, I think some of the things that we discovered where you talk about like bulk creation, like that was something that we enabled, but we also had a problem where we only would give back a sort of slimmed down set of data when you called to get a list of like all your contacts, for example. But if you wanted to dig down and get all the address data and everything, you'd have to call the endpoint for each contact one after the other, and that's where those rate limits came in.
Yeah,
so
a lot of calls.
So a lot of API calls if you have thousands of contacts or thousands of invoices. And so we ended up implementing pagination. So you could pass in and you could get back 100 detailed records at a time. So 10 API calls got you 1,000 records. And so that was like a really big thing. But we had to constantly beat that drum and educate developers, because they would just go in and just start using the APIs, and they wouldn't necessarily catch that, oh, that's the magic trick that I need to employ so I can avoid hitting those rate limits. But I also would sometimes, I definitely sat down on calls with partners, and they were like, we're hitting rate limits. And I love this topic. And we actually looked through their log files, and I was like, looking at it, I was like, we were talking through their code, and we were talking, and then he goes, oh, I'm looping over something, and I'm calling it like 100 times when I really only need to call it one time. And so like, just by looking at the logs and talking through it with them, like they discovered that they'd had a little bug in their code, that if they just moved this one API call outside of this loop, that it totally solved all their problems. So yeah, you can find solutions on the macro as well as the micro when you look at API logs. So there's magic in there.
Magic and API logs, I like it. So for partnership teams that are kind of rolling out this function at their company, because they're kind of trying to scale their program, do you have thoughts on what the sort of North Star metrics and KPIs that they should kind of look to put upon the developer relations function?
Yeah, that's a real I think that's an interesting one. When you talk about partnerships, it really depends on what your program involves. Like, is it how many new partners are we getting to sign up? Is it how many are we actually qualifying? How many we actually launch in our marketplace or our directory? Those were all things that we tracked at Xero, but we'd been doing it for several years. And what we noticed was that partners would get stuck like midway through the process, and they would just sit there for months and months, and we'd be like, why are they stuck at that stage? And so we actually started digging into our Salesforce data, and we started to see that certain steps were where people got stuck. And so we started to look at like, is there a problem with our process? Are we asking, did we set the hurdle that's like too high for people? Is there something that in our process that's broken? And so by looking at how quickly they moved from stage to stage and where people were getting stuck in that journey, helped us kind of reevaluate and optimize to move people through. So our metric became like, how quickly can we move people from stage to stage? And we started looking at the average time people spent on different stages. And, we saw like, we were able to really optimize and see like big gains in the velocity that we were able to get partners through. But, when you're just starting out, sticking with some of those just basic numbers might be where you begin, because, you're not worried about velocity when you're just starting out a program.
Yeah, you might even be more concerned about just successfully onboarding partners. So you might be a little bit more almost trying to recruit developers to actually build on you and get that front end number up. But then as you scale, you might be more focused on let's push them all the way through and have like a lot of prioritization and quality control. So last question, if people are sort of have this function, but they don't feel like executive is fully supportive of the business impact, do you have sort of some thoughts and arguments that people can use to try to just circulate within their organization, either to executive leadership or to other departments, about the importance of this function?
Yeah, I think my sort of natural position is to go and start like thinking of all the reasons why this program is so important. And I don't always know if that's necessarily the right way to approach it. I think if you turn it around and you ask the executive, uh, why did we start this program? Like, what did we hope to get out of this? And what why did we build this API in the first place? What were we, as a business, what were our goals? What were we trying to accomplish? and get them thinking about, like, why did we even decide to go in this direction? And then say, has our strategy changed? Is there, is this really not a priority anymore? Like, it being honest about, like, why you're doing this as an organization. If you are coming from a position of, I'm trying to defend and justify this, then it's real easy for an executive to dismiss your arguments. But if you instead, prompt them to think deeply about how this fits into the business, um, that might be a bit more persuasive, I think. I definitely know that for me, we always struggled to have that direct line to revenue. And I think when you've got a SaaS product, you can get blinders on as leaders, and you can say it's all about subscription growth. It's all about maximizing revenue through that mechanism. And you might forget that your product is actually part of a world of products, and no customer really wants their data sitting in a silo and not being able to share it with all the other apps that they use on a day-to-day basis. I know small business customers use, like, on average, like 18 different apps. And so not being able to use Zapier or use some other tool to, like, move data from place to place is a real strike against your product. And also, I know when we talked about it at Zero, the customers who actually connected like 2 or more apps to Zero saw this huge drop off in churn. And so if you want to talk real money, talk about lifetime value of the customer. But I really would hope the executives would be aware of that. But if they aren't, you could always prompt them with a couple of those sort of things. But I hope that they would understand, like, why you built this in the first place. Why do you have a program, and why it's important. And if they don't remember, you can always try to gently remind them of the power of a connected application.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, trying to find that strategic alignment. And to your point, if the function was started, somebody believed in it in the beginning, but but sometimes people can be short-sighted, right? Leaders can change, people can be short-sighted. I think those later arguments are good for leadership because they connect back to revenue, but I think, people are becoming more and more aware of those connections as well, and I think that people are becoming more aware of the value of community in SaaS, and so I think that kind of ties into development relations as well, where a lot of their function is about building that community.
Yeah.
Um,
And I always go to, the customer, right? Does having an API and ecosystem, does that ultimately deliver a more value and a better customer experience? And I always seem to come up with the answer yes. Maybe I'm biased, but but I really believe that it does. And so it's kind of hard to deny that you're making your customers happier, that's not something that you would want to support as a business, because those customers are going to become your advocates. They're the ones who are going to be recommending your product to other people. And it's hard to measure, but it's extremely valuable, I think.
I agree, but I'm also biased. Thank you for joining us today. Is there somewhere that people can find you if they want to read or learn more? Lob.com probably. Are you on LinkedIn, Twitter?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Sydney Allen. So just look me up there. You can find me on LinkedIn at Sid Maestre. I've got some YouTube talks about, my favorite one is structuring partner programs for success. I did the talk at Nordic APIs in 2018. Got a few thumbs up on that on YouTube. So go check that out. You might enjoy that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. If you're someone who is working on building and scaling SaaS product partnerships, we invite you to apply to be a member of our community at saasecosystemalliance.com.